Okay.
Welcome to the Dr. David Yen Memorial Lecture. I'd like to say just a few words about the David Yen before we start. The late David Yen was one of the three revered grandfathers of tobacco control in Asia, along with the late Dr. Takeshi Hirayama in Japan and Dr. Untitled in China. Dr. Yen was born to a well-off family in Shanghai in 1921. After he studied in China, Japan, and the US, he went into business in Brazil, but finally settled in Taiwan in 1965. He was very accomplished. He mastered 6 languages, including Japanese, Spanish, Portuguese, and English. He started smoking at the age of 11 years and chain smoked 40 cigarettes per day for over 40 years. This led to the removal of his right lung at the age of 52. From that moment on, he dedicated his life to reducing tobacco use. During the 1980s, the trade arm of the US government threatened several countries in Asia with unilateral trade sanctions unless these countries opened their market to and allowed advertising of US tobacco products, even in countries with national advertising bans. Dr. Yen decided that a regional organization and a pan-Asian strategy were needed to combat these threats. So in 1989, he founded and funded the Asia-Pacific Association for the Control of Tobacco, APACT, of which he became honorary vice president. APACT submitted a petition to the US government and lobbied the US Congress, urging it to stop using trade threats on tobacco. Currently, APACT has members from virtually all countries in the region. Dr. David Yen's vision of an Asian family has become a reality. Dr. Yen was a kind and generous man, but one whose relentless devotion to the anti-tobacco movement won him the title of Lin Zhu of the modern world. After the Qing dynasty official whose ban on the import of opium led to the Opium War of the 19th century. Without exception, tobacco control advocates around Asia revere Dr. Yen for his pioneering work. He received many honors and awards, including the World Health Organization Commemorative Medal, prestigious Royal Award from the King of Thailand, and a Buddhist Compassion Award, learning that he had also received the Man with a Good Heart Award, made me smile and remember him fondly. So what would David Yen have wished for today? He would have wished us to continue the APACT family, to give birth to new generations of advocates, and to learn from and to support each other. He would have wished for a better future for the youth of Asia, free from the addiction of all forms of tobacco. Which brings me to today's speaker for this memorial lecture. Dr. Simon Chapman is Emeritus Professor in Public Health at the University of Sydney in Australia. He's been working in tobacco control for many, many, many decades. In 1997, he won the World Health Organization's Gold No Tobacco Day Medal. And in 2003, he was awarded the American Cancer Society Libertarian Award for outstanding individual leadership in tobacco control. In 2008, he won the New South Wales Premier's Cancer Researcher of the Year Medal. He was the Foundation Deputy Editor, then Editor, of the British Medical Journal's Tobacco Control over 17 years. In 2013, he was made an officer in the Order of Australia for his contributions to public health. And this is the second highest civic honour bestowed on Australian citizens by the Governor General. His topic will be Myth-Busting 12 Cardinal Beliefs in Modern Vaping Theology. So over to you, Simon, thanks, and welcome.
Thank you, Judith. Now, well, good morning, everybody. From Sydney, it's a beautiful, beautiful sunny day in Sydney, and of course we're in lockdown like a lot of nations are around the world. We've been in lockdown for 9 weeks. I haven't seen my wonderful grandchildren in all that time, so it's not a very happy time for the world. But today I hope to keep you interested and entertained with a presentation looking at 12 cardinal beliefs in what I call modern vaping theology. Now, I call it theology because we know that people who are heavily into vaping advocacy are almost like religious converts. They're people who are deeply, deeply committed to a set of beliefs, and they put these beliefs and statements in all their submissions, in many of their speeches and their interviews. We've encountered them all, and I've collected together what I think are some of the 12 most prominent and prevalent ones, and I want to take you through those today. So let us proceed. You can see on the screen now that there are 12 tenets of vaping theology cultists. I call it a cult because really there is very little debate within vaping theology about what everybody who supports it is supposed to believe. So you can see on the screen, I won't read out all those now because I'm going to take you through them one at a time.
Simon, could I interrupt? We haven't got your screen slides up at the moment.
Oh, okay.
The screen sharing at the bottom.
Okay, so we'll try and...
Screen sharing.
Yeah.
That's it, thank you.
Okay, you can see it now? Good.
Yes.
Now,
Can we go back to perhaps? Could you go back to your first slide?
Okay, so that's the first slide. Can you see that now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so they're all the 12 beliefs, the main 12 tenets that I'm going to be talking about. And I'll move straight away to the first one, which is one that you're all familiar certainly with, because this has been megaphoned around the world since around about 2014, when a paper was published containing this statement. It was put together in a meeting which was chaired and convened by Professor David Nutt, who you see on the screen there. Now, Professor Nutt is a person who's given to some rather hyperbolic statements. He said, for example, that vaping is the most significant advance in medicine since antibiotics. And then, as if to go even one better, he's also said they're the greatest advance since vaccinations. And something even more sweeping, that the rejection of the harm reduction from vaping is perhaps the worst example of scientific denial since the Catholic Church banned the works of Copernicus way back in 1616. So this is, if you like, the tone of the person who convened this meeting together. Now, there were about 12 people who attended these. They're all hand-picked, and some of the names in that meeting were very familiar to us, people who have before that and since taken a very high profile in advocating for the virtues of vaping. The statement that vaping is 95% less harmful than smoking is the single most prominent statement that came out of that report. You can see on the screen that Public Health England's Professor John Newton, who was, I think, one of the most senior people in Public Health England, in 2017, he said to my government's House of Representatives Committee that there was a lot of nonsense being talked about this 95% figure. He said it's getting beyond a joke, really. We're really very clear that this is just one of the figures that Public Health England had used in their report. But he said that what really matters is the evidence underlying this figure from the Nutt report. But if we turn to the Nutt report and we look at what the words in the Nutt report are about the quality of the evidence that they used to come up with that 95% figure, deep down in the discussion section of the paper, we can read a limitation of this study is the lack of hard evidence for the harms of most of the products on most of the criteria. Now, I don't think that I have ever seen a more sweeping caveat in all my academic life than something like that. So somebody to write that at the beginning, at the end of their paper as a qualifier for the main finding that they came to about e-cigarettes, to say that there was a lack of hard evidence for the harms of most of the products, that's most of the nicotine products, on most of the criteria. I don't think there are really research limitations get any more fundamental than that. So even hardline vaping cultists, Carl Phillips is someone that you may have heard of. He published something on his blog a few years ago which seemed to indicate that he thinks that figure is total rubbish as well. And you can see there, I've extracted from his blog there. He says that the specific point estimate, that is 95%, has rapidly evolved into fact in the political sense of that term. It's repeated in large fraction of the population of reports and widely used in arguments, snipes, broadsides, etc. It seems to have emerged from nowhere when the Public Health England report asserted that figure again. They traced that to what was actually a huge misrepresentation of what was only a made-up number from one junk science journal figure. Now, what we need to understand, of course, is that that vaping, e-cigarettes, have only been around for relatively little time, and that smoking-caused diseases are chronic diseases, cancer, heart disease, lung diseases. They're not like, for example, viruses, that if you acquire the virus, you start getting ill very soon after it. They instead have very long latencies between the start and use of the products which cause, those chronic diseases like tobacco smoking, and disease diagnosis up to 20, perhaps even up to 50 years later. And that vaping has been common, very common in very few nations for maybe 5 to 10 years, and certainly at the time that that report was assembled, 2013, 2014, very, very few years indeed. So let's go to the next one. On the screen now, we see a book cover from a famous surgeon, US surgeon called Alton Ochsner. And in that book, Ochsner recalls his attendance at his first lung cancer autopsy way back in 1919. And he was told by his professor that he might never see such a case as long as he lived. And in fact, Ochsner did not see another case of lung cancer for another 17 years in 1936. And then he saw another 9 cases in the months after that. And of course, it's now public health history that ever since, lung cancer has been by far the world's leading cause of cancer death. So it's important for us to understand there that in people trying to say just how dangerous or how safe e-cigarettes are, we really, really are in the infancy of our understanding what the risks are likely to be. We might hope that they are very benign, but we might be very concerned that the evidence that we've got so far is not a very firm basis on which to make statements one way or the other about how dangerous or safe e-cigarettes are indeed. But that is not stopping some people from making those sort of statements. And here on the screen we can see a paper which is titled "The Health Impact of E-Cigarettes, a prospective 3.5-year study of regular daily users who have never smoked." In other words, they've only used e-cigarettes for 3.5 years. There were only 16 people in that study. 4 dropped out, 3 were excluded, and so there are actually only 9 subjects in this study which concluded that the study did not demonstrate that there were health concerns associated with what the authors call long-term use of electronic cigarettes. Now, 3.5 years, from what I've been saying about the latency periods for cigarette smoking's harms is not long-term use. So this particular paper was picked up in the world press. There was a lot of coverage given to this. It was then amplified and megaphoned and telegraphed all around the world. Oh, a study has just shown that there are no health concerns associated with long-term use of electronic cigarettes. Really crazy stuff. So, so the second tenet that we need to look at is this one we're looking at now, that it's not too soon to call all these cigarettes all but 100% safe, is what I've just been talking about. In 2018, the report, the big doorstopper thick report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine in the United States, had this to say in its summary of conclusions about the health effects of e-cigarettes. Conclusion 7.1, there is substantial evidence that e-cigarette aerosols can induce acute endothelial cell dysfunction, although the long-term consequences and outcomes of these parameters with long-term exposure to e-cigarettes are uncertain. Conclusion 7.2, there is substantial evidence that components of e-cigarettes aerosols can promote formation of, I can't read some of the words on this because the pictures of Judith and myself are blocking them out at the end there, but you can see it on your screen. So conclusion 7.2 says there are other substantial causes of concern, and this is early in the piece. So if we're starting to see august bodies like the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine talking about substantial evidence for early evidence that there are concerns, what might be down the track is really anybody's guess, but it's very, very worrying. So moving on to the next one.
Simon, if you go to full screen, I think it'll be even more visible. If you go down to full screen.
Are you on full screen there?
No, if you're on your slides, go down to full screen below. I think that's it. Yeah, I think that will.
I'll just see what this looks like. Yeah, that might be a bit better.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So the third one is that, now I can't see the top. Oh yes, and if I bump that out of the road, I can. That nicotine is almost harmless, that it's smoke that causes all the harm. Now, of course, this is a statement which is traced back to Michael Russell, Dr. Michael Russell from the Institute of Psychiatry in England. He made that statement way back in 1976. Now, 1976 was a long, long time ago. It was before the internet, before the fax machine. It was before an awful lot of things that we take for granted in our life today. Science was not as robust as it was, as it is today. So since that time, vaping advocates have promoted nicotine as almost entirely harmless. In fact, they often talk about it as if it's a vitamin-like substance, something that's almost good for us to take. And you can see a picture that I've got there that I took from a vapor in Australia who's always all over social media, highlighting the wonderful things that nicotine can do for you. So we'll move along here. So in fact, but if you take the trouble to go into the scientific literature on nicotine, if you go into PubMed, you know, the site where you can look up huge millions and millions of scientific papers published in all branches of medicine, and put in words like nicotine, angiogenesis, apoptosis, cell division, things like that, you'll find quite a lot of papers like this one that's on the screen here, a review article, Nicotine's Specific Role in Angiogenesis, Proliferation and Apoptosis. And the author says here, nicotine deregulates essential biological processes like the regulation of cell proliferation, apoptosis, migration, invasion, angiogenesis, inflammation, and cell-mediated immunity. Doesn't sound like we're talking about something which is almost 100% benign. It sounds like we're talking about something that there really is some deep scientific concern about. And it's certainly something that we shouldn't be putting in the hands or the mouths of school children. Neil Benowitz is probably in the top 5 toxicology people working in the world in the area of nicotine dependencies from the University of San Francisco in the United States. And in 2019, he went over to the Warsaw conference that the vapers go to. And I've looked through his slides. One of his early slides where he summarises what his talk's about, he puts up, as you can see, addiction, cardiovascular disease, reproductive toxicity, impaired adolescent brain development, infectious disease, cancer and COPD. And you can see there, addiction, definite evidence of concern, major area of safety concern, cardiovascular disease, reproductive toxicity, probable, and possible for another 3 there, unlikely for COPD. So this is the word to a vaping conference of the sort of areas of concern. It's not, nicotine is not a totally benign substance. Now, obviously, we've got to, highlight addiction here. Addiction is a problem in its own right. The vapers try to paint this as some sort of moral crusade against people who are concerned about it, vaping, that we're just worried about, that it's wrong for people to be addicted. Well, it's actually a big problem that's hand in glove with a lot of the problems that addiction can cause. So, for example, if we look at the puffs that vapers take, the typical smoker who smokes cigarettes, we're talking about someone who might say smoke 12 cigarettes a day, takes about 8 puffs a day on average. Sorry, not a day, per cigarette. So if they're taking 12 cigarettes a day, that's about 96 puffs a day. The average vapor, we know from the literature, takes around about 200 puffs a day, and I found one paper which showed that there was one subject who was taking 611 puffs a day, or 222,000 puffs. So just think about that kind of continual kind of basting of the lungs and the airways that somebody who is vaping is engaged in. Many of you watching me today will have seen vapers. You might have been standing near them in a crowd. I was at a climate march a few years ago for children, and it was very, very packed. There were tens of thousands of people there. There was a man next to me vaping, and I was just watching him, and he was doing it non-stop. It was almost a frantic kind of behaviour. And yet we still find that there are people saying, oh, well, nicotine's actually not very addictive when it's vaped. It's only very addictive when it comes in cigarettes. Well, really, this is part of the kind of vaping theology. The next one is flavouring. We know that there are thousands of flavouring chemicals that are available for people who are vaping. I saw one report recently suggesting, I think it was again from California, that there were up to 15,000 different flavours that if you took the trouble to sort of map them on the internet that were being offered in sales, there are about 15,000 flavours out there now. On the screen we can see a person who is using a Ventolin, a salbutamol inhaler for the control of asthma. In Australia, in my country, where we have 25 million people, there are 2.7 million people with asthma who, most of them are using these apparatuses to help them control their asthma. Now, the average daily person who's using one of these puffers takes about 1 to 2 puffs, a maximum of about 4 times over a 24-hour period. You compare that to what the typical vapor is doing when they're pulling the flavours in vaping down over their through their airways and into their lungs. Now, salbutamol, any of you who are asthmatic yourself or have got children who might be, will know that it doesn't taste particularly pleasant. Now, wouldn't you think that the pharmaceutical companies who manufacture salbutamol would just love to put flavoured salbutamol in those puffers? But yet you speak to any respiratory physician and say, is there such a thing as flavoured salbutamol? And the answer is no. There would probably be much better compliance in the use of this drug if it could be flavoured with, you know, some of the lovely sounding flavours that we see with e-cigarettes. The US Flavouring and Manufacturing, the Flavour and Extracts Manufacturing Association this year made this statement: e-cigarette manufacturers should not represent or suggest that the flavour ingredients in their products are safe because they have FEMA, that's their organisation's status, for use as food, because such statements are false and misleading. So here we have on screen someone probably well known to some of you. This is Clive Bates, who is one of the world's most prominent vaping advocates. He used to, many years ago, run Action on Smoking and Health in England. And last year, he gave evidence to a Senate inquiry in Australia. And he was asked by one of the senators about this very point that I'm talking about. The senator said, a lot of these flavours are they approved for they're approved for ingestion in foods, but not for inhalation into your lungs. And Clive Bates replied, no less than 3 times, you're right. Many of them have not been evaluated for inhalation. And again, so you're right, I've highlighted in red, and down the bottom, but you're perfectly correct. None of the flavours have been evaluated as safe for inhalation. So they admit this when they're put on the spot about it. So what you're inhaling when you're inhaling e-cigarettes is, of course, vaporized nicotine, propylene glycol, flavouring agents, and sloughed off fine particles, fine heavy metal particles from the heating coil and so forth. But you know, it's the flavouring which is bringing a lot of children into this whole thing, and we're experimenting on our children with chemicals which have not been approved or tested for safety with inhalation. I can't emphasise how important this point is. Okay, so the next one is that dual users significantly reduce the cigarettes that they smoke per day. They mightn't, they say, well, because they're dual users, that means by definition they're still smoking and vaping. But they say, but it doesn't really matter that they're still smoking because they're greatly reducing the amount of cigarettes that they're smoking in a day. So isn't that a no-brainer that this is a wonderful thing that is happening because they're vaping? Well, in fact, if you look at the literature on reduced cigarette smoking, what happens to health outcomes in people who cut down their cigarettes by even more than 50% a day, there is quite a lot of literature out there. And I've got 2 examples of it on the screen. One from Norway in 2006. There was no evidence that smokers who cut down their daily cigarette consumption by more than 50% reduced their risk of premature death significantly. And another more recent one in JAMA, published in 2020, suggesting the same thing, that while there was some decreased mortality risk, that lifelong daily smokers have higher mortality risk than never smokers, even amongst those smoking 10 cigarettes a month. Thus, all smokers should quit regardless of how infrequently they smoke. So this argument that, you know, this is a real benefit that people are cutting down is really, really oversold. Okay, so the 6th one, that second-hand vape is harmless. Well, the first thing that we should say about this, that in plain sight, we can see that there is no airline anywhere in the world which allows vaping on board. Now, why might that be? Is it because that airlines employ epidemiologists who advise them, you know, in their board meetings that they shouldn't do this? Or is it that they actually do understand that there are risks involved, that maybe they have put consultants onto this, they have consulted expertise about it? So let's have a look at what vape is. We hear a lot of stuff like it's just like being in the shower, it's just like steam from a kettle, all of that sort of thing. Well, two papers up here. First by Foucault, where he said that particle number distribution modes of the electronic cigarette generated aerosol are in the 120 to 165 range, similar to the conventional cigarette. And in another paper below by Sewell and others, published in Tobacco Control in 2017, they went into a vaping festival where there were lots of people vaping. And of course, that's what vapers would like to see. They would like to see vaping being allowed in bars and restaurants and all indoor sort of areas where cigarette smoking is banned. And in this study by Sewell and others, they found that PM2.5 concentrations at a vaping event, where 86 vapers were present, were comparable to the concentrations reported previously in hookah cafes and bars where cigarette smoking was allowed. Yes, one vape is going to produce less particles than one cigarette, but when you have a lot of people who are vaping together, you get really significant concentrations of particles in the air that people are being asked to breathe in. So let's move on to the next one. And this is that what we call the hardening hypothesis, the idea that many smokers can't quit, and so that e-cigarettes are therefore needed. We've all heard this argument, you know, that people who are denying or inhibiting the introduction of e-cigarettes, the availability of e-cigarettes, are really being very, very callous and cruel to all of those people who cannot quit. Well, John Hughes is perhaps one of the top 5 cessation researchers in the world from the United States. And in 2020, in the journal Nicotine and Tobacco Research, he looked at 26 studies which had examined the evidence for so-called the hardening hypothesis. And he found that in none of those 26 studies was there any evidence for transition from current to former smoking, a reduction in the number of quit attempts, a reduction in the success of any given quit attempt, with several studies finding that in fact these measures increased over time. No reduction, you know, well, you can read this stuff for yourself. And his conclusion was that these results convincingly indicate that hardening is not occurring in the general population of smokers. In fact, if anything, there is far more evidence that smoking is softening. In countries where smoking is going down, rather than the smokers who remain being heavier and heavier and heavier, they are in fact lighter and lighter than they've ever been. The number of cigarettes that they're smoking is reducing rather than going up, which is what the hardening hypothesis would predict. So the next one is that e-cigarettes are very effective for smoking cessation. This, I guess, is probably, along with their safety, the most prominent argument. They're saying that this is, you know, an enormously important breakthrough in helping people quit smoking. So the Cochrane Library Tobacco Addiction Group last year published a review, and you can see there that what they concluded was that for every 100 people using nicotine cigarettes to stop smoking, 10 might successfully stop, compared with only 6 of 100 people using nicotine replacement therapy or nicotine-free cigarettes, or 4 of people who were having no support or behavioural support only, people who are trying to quit on their own, in other words. So let's just flip this around and put it in plain English. If we if we put it another way, if we take smokers participating, 100 smokers participating, 90 would still be smoking months later if they used e-cigarettes, compared with a little bit less who were using NRT, and 96 who tried to quit alone. So let me put this to you. If you went along to your doctor and the doctor, you had a health problem, and the doctor said, here, take this drug, I think it'll be really good for you. It has a 90% failure rate, but I'm going to describe it to you as being very successful. What would you think? You would think that your doctor really had lost control of his senses, you know. So the idea that is being promoted that e-cigarettes are amazingly disrupting for smoking cessation, they are a breakthrough, a magic bullet, is actually not borne out at all. Now, the Cochrane collaboration based its findings and its conclusions on randomised controlled trials. Randomised controlled trials are very, very different to the way in which people use e-cigarettes in the real world. For a start, randomised controlled trials exclude a lot of people from participating in randomised controlled trials. And one study I looked at showed that 59% of people who would be motivated to quit would be excluded from being a participant in a randomised controlled trial. For example, anyone with mental health problems aren't allowed in randomised controlled trials. People in those often get other support as well. They get counselling, and that's not what happens when you go and buy an e-cigarette, you know, at the supermarket or wherever. You don't get counselling along about how to use it. People in randomised controlled trials have lots of contact with researchers. In fact, it averages 7.6 number of contacts that they have with the researchers, who ring them up, contact them and say, how are you getting along there? You know, good, anything I can do to sort of help you, etc., etc. That doesn't happen either when you're buying e-cigarettes. Smokers can also tell when they're allocated to placebo in randomised controlled trial. We know that from research, because when you think about it, if you're addicted to nicotine and you're given the placebo in a nicotine replacement trial, in other words, you're not given nicotine, you're going to know pretty quickly that you're on the placebo, because all your smoking life, when your blood hasn't got enough nicotine in it, your brain is saying to you, quick, have another cigarette and you'll feel better quickly. So if you're on placebo, the integrity of the randomised controlled trial is compromised. Also, dropout rates in randomised controlled trials are far less than they are in the real world. We know that, for example, with varenicline, around about 50% of people who are prescribed varenicline did not renew their script as they should be. So they're major, major dropout in real world conditions of use. And of course, in randomised controlled trials, participants get their drugs for nothing, and they're often sometimes paid to be in trials as well. So for all of those reasons, randomised controlled trials are very, very different in the way that they're conducted to how these drugs are actually used in the real world. If we look at cohort studies, and the biggest one in the world is the APACT study in the United States, this is where you get a large group of randomly selected people and you follow them for several years. And PATH now is reporting, I think, on the 4th year of that cohort. You look at what I've highlighted in the red circles on the screen there, and you can see that, yes, there are people who do have a positive outcome. Around about 18% of people who are using e-cigarettes had a positive outcome from using e-cigarettes. But if we look at which people had negative outcomes, or people who just were held in the same situation that they were, it's a far bigger effect. So there are far more people who are getting negative outcomes than are getting positive outcomes, and an even further bigger number who are just being held in it. So if e-cigarettes are being argued as an off-ramp out of smoking, it's far more realistic to describe them as a hold you in smoking mechanism than they are an off-ramp out of smoking. And of course, that's why the tobacco companies like them a great deal. So this, I'm just looking at my clock. I don't have a long time to go, so I won't, this is just more evidence about smoking cessation and how really it's being so oversold by e-cigarette advocates. NASM conclusion about smoking cessation was that overall there is limited evidence that e-cigarettes may be effective aids to promote smoking. There is moderate evidence from randomised controlled trials, but there is insufficient evidence from RCTs about the effectiveness of e-cigarettes as cessation aids compared to no treatment or to FDA-approved smoking cessation treatments. This is, you know, a review body of not e-cigarette advocates, but of scientists who looked at the data dispassionately. So the ninth one is that we hear it argued that nations which have really opened the floodgates to e-cigarettes are seeing smoking prevalence falling much faster than foolish nations who are inhibiting the uptake of it. Now, Professor Robert West, who many of us will know is a leading scholar and researcher in tobacco control and smoking cessation, gave a very interesting interview about this on the BBC in 2016. He said actually the impact across the whole population has actually been relatively small. He said, now that raises an interesting question. If e-cigarettes were a game changer, if they were going to have, you know, a massive effect on everyone switching to cigarettes and stopping smoking, we might have expected to see a bigger effect than what we've seen so far, which has actually been relatively small. Moving more ahead here, we can see in the next slide that there is in fact little difference between vapers, ex-vapers and never vapers in the number of daily cigarettes that they are smoking. You can see there in 2017, current e-cigarette users were smoking 10.5 cigarettes a day, ex-ones were smoking 11.9, and people right on the other side never vaped with 10.1. These are not really different sorts of figures, so they're not having big population effects. This is a really interesting graph on the next slide here. If we see what we've got here is that in the orange thing we've got quit attempts using e-cigarettes, and in the blue line we're looking at smoking prevalence in the UK. So smoking prevalence is gently going down, whereas there is a dramatic increase, as we can see in the middle there, of people using e-cigarettes to quit. Now, looking at that, if anyone can see that there is obviously a dramatic increase, or decrease, I should say, in smoking prevalence following the dramatic increase in people using e-cigarettes to quit, well then you've got better vision than I have. There is nothing obviously sticking out there in these British government official figures. But what has been happening in the UK is shown on this next slide, where the red line indicates tobacco price index relative to the retail price index, and that is the, you know, the actual real affordability of cigarettes there. And the blue line shows the prevalence of current smoking in the UK in people aged 15 plus. So what is perhaps driving prevalence down in an alternative explanation? Probably something to do with the real increase in the price of cigarettes that's going on, something that all people in tobacco control have understood for very many years. So the next one is, are e-cigarettes a gateway into smoking? There are many cohort studies which show that youth who use e-cigarettes have a higher I can't read that word again, I've got the thing on the thing on the slide there. Anyway, this is all typically dismissed by common liability theory. People are just saying, well, look, kids who try stuff are going to try stuff. People who are going to take up vaping will have taken it up anyway. They take up all sorts of other behaviours that are worrying and that sort of thing. They say there is alleged incompatibility of falling youth smoking with rising vaping, and they use the argument that most youth smokers are not daily but infrequent vapers. They're only doing it experimentally, and it's not plausible to say that this could ever lead to a gateway because they're only doing it in an experimental way. And they argue that e-cigarettes are a gateway out of smoking, not into smoking. So what does NASEM conclude about all of this, rather than what the vaping theologists say about it? Well, NASEM says that there is, in fact, substantial evidence that e-cigarettes increase the risk of ever using combustible tobacco cigarettes among youth and young adults, and that among youth and young adult e-cigarette users who ever use combustibles tobacco cigarettes, there is moderate evidence that e-cigarette users increases the frequency and intensity of subsequent combustible tobacco smoking. So who are you going to believe, NASEM, or are you going to believe the people who are just saying this over and over again? A very, very recent paper just came out this year, just a few weeks ago. I would really draw your attention to there. Again, looking at the clock, I see I've only got 3 minutes and I've got a couple of slides to go. So I would urge you to come back and look at that paper in great detail. It's a very, very important paper for this debate. That's the summary of it on that slide there. So the 11th one is that people say that big tobacco is a minor player in vaping, and that all companies support light regulation. So what we really need to understand here, folks, is that tobacco companies, yes, they're all involved in smoking and in vaping as well as in smoking. And yes, there are a lot of independent, smaller companies. You can see in the numbers there, 56.2% of the people who are in the vaping trade are not in the big tobacco companies. But what will be happening is, as has been happening already, is that all the really profitable ones, the ones who are really making inroads, will be swallowed up by big tobacco as part of their mission to get people smoking and vaping, not vaping instead of smoking. They're not in the mission of trying to wipe out smoking. They're in the mission of trying to just expand the number of mouths that they can put things into. And the final one is that big tobacco is not trying to get out of smoking. We know this because all tobacco companies are continuing to oppose effective tobacco control all over the world. We went through years and years of trying to bat off all the tobacco companies who were trying to ban plain packaging in Australia. We know that all the cigarette divisions within all of these companies, the staff have in those cigarette divisions key performance indicators which are tied to cigarette growth. They're rewarded if they sell more cigarettes. All of those companies have shareholders to whom they have a fiduciary duty to maximise returns, and that none of those companies have announced unconditional deadlines to ban tobacco sales, and all use the excuse that, well, we're not going to announce a ban on tobacco sales because all the other companies will just keep on marketing cigarettes anyway, so we'd never be so stupid as to do that. So it's always, always, always just something into the future where they're actually taking no action. So our final two slides are these. We can conceive of e-cigarettes as a genie. It might be a wonderful magic genie, which if let out of the bottle, really does drive smoking down and not harm people who vape, as we can see the genie on the left, or it might be a very evil genie who, once out of the bottle, causes all sorts of harm and undoes a lot of the work that all of us in tobacco control have been doing for years and years. And as we all know, it is very, very difficult to put genies back in their bottles. And my final slide is that this is an advertisement for my new book, which will be out next year. It's called Smoking Cessation, Methods of Mass Distraction. And one of those methods is, of course, e-cigarettes. So that book will be finished by the end of this year, and then it will be put together by the publisher and be available to everybody for next year. So thank you so much for your time today. It's been a wonderful honour to be selected by the committee to give this talk today, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Judith ไม่มีเสียง
Thank you very much for that wonderful lecture, which in fact includes every counter-argument. And I think it would be immensely useful for countries around Asia to have this collection of counter-arguments while they're trying to battle, firstly with their governments to introduce bans on e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, but also to counteract the industry and what they're saying as well. So I think my final comment would be that Dr. David Yen would have loved this lecture. So thank you very much indeed. And I'll now hand over to you, who will be chairing the next session. So thank you again, Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith.
Simon and Judith, it has been a wonderful presentation and really admirable to the people who are trying to get cessation smoking. And very good moderator as Judith has been done. Okay, thank you very much indeed on behalf of the APACT 2021 and the Executive Committee. Thank you very much indeed